In July 1966, a mass murder occurred in Chicago. A deranged man forced his way into a townhome where student nurses lived. By the end of the night, 8 women had been brutally killed. One woman survived and went on to bravely make sure that the man who murdered her friends would be sent to prison for life. This was one of the first mass murders to occur in the Midwest, so it shocked the public. It is known as the crime of the century.
What you locked up for? It's count for murder. Did you kill him? Sure I did. Why? Just one minute night.
Hi everyone, my name's Anne, but I also go by my nickname Nini. I like to focus on Midwest true crime because I'm a Minnesota farmer's daughter. Today we're going to go to Illinois and talk about the infamous mass murder of nurses that occurred in Chicago. This was requested by one of my favorite subscribers, Karen Pearson. You give me so much support on both of my channels, so thank you so much for that. And you also suggest really good true crime cases, so thank you again for that. The man who committed this murder is Richard Speck, and oh my gosh, is he a deviant. He did end up going to prison for these murders, and in most cases, that's where the story ends. But not for Richard Speck. Things got super weird after he went to prison. But let's start at the beginning. Richard Speck was born in Illinois on December 6, 1941. He was the 7th child in a family of 8 kids. Richard was very close to his dad, but when he was just 6, his father had a heart attack and died. This devastated Richard. He acted like a toddler and whined. He ate crayons. He acted out in school. His mother married a traveling salesman from Texas, and the family moved there. Richard's biological father had been a sober, hardworking man. His stepfather was an alcoholic with a criminal record of DUIs and forgery. He was verbally abusive and called Richard a gutter rat and told him he couldn't stand the sight of him. Richard hated his stepfather and he resented his mother for marrying him and making them move to Texas. When Richard was 12, he broke into his stepfather's liquor cabinet and drank alcohol. He started doing this regularly, and by the time he was 15, he was getting drunk pretty much every day. Not surprisingly, he didn't do well in school and had to repeat the 8th grade. He dropped out in the 9th grade. He started hanging out with an older crowd who introduced him to crime, drugs, casual sex. Over the course of his life, Richard would rack up an extensive criminal record. His first arrest was when he was 13 years old, and he would end up being arrested 40 times in his life. His crimes included shoplifting, indecent exposure, burglary, disorderly conduct, aggravated assault, and disturbing the peace. At some point, he got a tattoo on his arm that said, "Born to Raise Hell." In October 1961, shortly before Richard turned 20, he met a 15-year-old named Shirley at the Texas State Fair. Just 3 weeks later, she was pregnant with his child. They got married in January 1962 and moved into an apartment. Richard worked as a delivery driver, but they struggled financially because Richard would spend his paychecks on alcohol and sex workers. And he didn't hide his escapades from his wife. For some reason, Richard got an idea in his head that Shirley was cheating on him, but she wasn't. But because of this, he felt the need to punish her. He would pick up women, park directly in front of their apartment, make out with them, and laugh at Shirley, who was sitting in the apartment, pregnant with his child. His daughter was born in July 1962, but Richard missed the birth because he was in jail for disturbing the peace. But maybe he wouldn't have been allowed at the birth anyway because it was the 1960s. But still, being in jail at the time of your daughter's birth is not good. Richard's treatment of his wife was horrible. He demanded sex from her multiple times a day, and if she said no, he would slap and choke her. In 1963, Richard cashed a coworker's $44 paycheck and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He only served 16 months and was let out on parole in 1965. Richard didn't even last a week out and about before he was arrested again. He attacked a woman in a parking lot and pointed a knife at her. He was convicted of aggravated assault and parole violation and sentenced to 16 months. There was some kind of error, though, and Richard was let out just 6 months later. In January 1966, Shirley filed for divorce. That same month, Richard got in a fight at a bar and stabbed a man. Richard was arrested for aggravated assault, but his mom hired a good defense lawyer who got that reduced to just disturbing the peace. So often we see people commit horrible crimes, but courts end up going easy on them. And then because they're not in jail or prison for that crime, they commit an even horrible crime. And that's what happened here. Richard stabbed a man, but because he was only charged with disturbing the peace, he was sentenced to 3 days in jail and he had to pay a $10 fine. And 6 months later, he committed a brutal mass murder and killed 8 women. In March of 1966, Richard stole 70 cartons of cigarettes from a grocery store and resold them out of his trunk. Police issued a warrant for his arrest, but he fled. He took a bus back to Illinois. He went to the small town of Monmouth, which is where he lived briefly when he was younger. He rented a room at the Christie Hotel and spent most of his time drinking at bars. Richard found out that Shirley remarried rather quickly, and this infuriated him because he hated her, and this pissed him off that she had moved on so quickly. This rage caused his bad behavior to start to escalate. On April 3rd, 1966, he broke into the home of 65-year-old Virgil Harris. He tied her up and raped her at knife point. He stole cash and other items before leaving. She told police the attacker had a slight southern drawl, which stood out in the Midwest. About a week later, a 32-year-old barmaid named Catherine Pierce was found dead in a hog house behind a tavern called Frank's Place. She had been hit so hard in her abdomen, her liver ruptured. Richard was a regular at Frank's Place, so police questioned him. They went to the Christie Hotel on April 19th to ask him more questions, but Richard had fled. It has never been proven in court that Richard attacked Virgil and killed Catherine, but when police searched his room at the Christie Hotel, they found the items that had been stolen from Virgil's house. Richard fled to Chicago and showed up at his sister Martha's house where she lived with her husband Gene. He told them he had to leave Monmouth because the local mafia was trying to get him to sell drugs, but they knew Richard's history, so they knew this was a lie. But since he was family, they let him stay with them. Gene got Richard a job as a seaman with the U.S. Merchant Marines. On April 30th, 1966, Richard sailed out of Chicago on a ship headed for Michigan's Upper Peninsula. 4 days later, he developed severe appendicitis. They sent him to a hospital in the Upper Peninsula where he had emergency surgery and stayed for 2 weeks recuperating. He then went back on the ship. But he was kind of a nuisance on the ship. He drank and did drugs, he exposed himself to his shipmates, and he even fell off the ship at one point. After he pulled a knife on an officer in June, he was kicked off the ship and he went back to his sister's house. For 2 weeks, all Richard did was drink and lay on the couch, so his sister kicked him out on July 11th. Richard, now 24 years old, moved into rooming houses. Gene took Richard to the National Maritime Union hiring hall to find assignment on a ship. This building was on 100th Street in Chicago, just across the street from townhomes where student nurses lived. In order to get work, Richard had to complete a physical at the hiring hall, and they took his fingerprints. Richard got assignment on a ship and went to the location to board it on July 12th, but there had been a mix-up, and another seaman with more seniority had been assigned the job. This pissed Richard off, so he went to bars to drink. He ended up in Luella Park, which was near the hiring hall. It's very likely as he was in the park, or all the times he was at the hiring hall, sulking about his life, Richard watched people go in and out of the nearby homes, including the nurses who lived in the nearby townhomes. The row of townhomes was owned by the South Chicago Community Hospital. They were set up like dorms for student nurses so they could live close to the hospital. It was a strict environment because they wanted the nurses to show professional behavior. A house mother lived in one of the townhomes and she enforced the rules. They had to dress properly, behave properly, keep their rooms tidy, only do laundry on the day assigned to you, and abide by the curfew and have lights out by 1 a.m. The townhome at 2319 East 100th Street was home to several American women who were finishing their last year of school and 3 Filipino nurses who were working at the hospital as part of a nursing exchange program. The Filipino women had only been in America for a few months. The nurses who lived in the townhome were Corazon Amaro, who went by Cora. She was born in the Philippines in 1943. She came from a large family of 8 children. Cora was tiny, just 4'10". She was smart, hardworking, and a devout Catholic. Gloria Davy was born on July 12, 1944, in Indiana. She had been a head cheerleader in high school, wrote for a community paper on teen issues, and was the Future Farmers of America's sweetheart. Suzanne Ferris was born on September 10th, 1944 in Chicago. She was a devout Catholic who went to Mass almost every morning before she went to work at the hospital. She was engaged to Philip Jordan, who was the brother of Mary Ann Jordan. They were planning to get married in June the following year. She had wanted to be a pediatric nurse. Merlita Gargulo was born on September 1st, 1942 in the Philippines. She loved to sing and was said to have a beautiful voice. She struggled being away from her family and boyfriend who were still in the Philippines. Mary Ann Jordan was born on October 4th, 1945 in Michigan. She actually didn't live at the townhouse, she lived with her parents, but she spent a lot of nights at the townhome because she was friends with the other nurses. Mary Ann was a member of the Future Nurses of America. Patricia Matusik was born December 8th, 1945 in Chicago. She was known as a gentle, friendly woman with an infectious smile. She was engaged and planning to get married after she graduated from nursing school. She had plans to work at a children's hospital. Valentina Passion was born on February 14th, 1942. She came from a large family of 6 kids. Valentina's salary was $350 a month, and she sent most of it to her family back in the Philippines, as did the other 2 Filipino nurses. Nina Jo Schmally was born on December 27, 1941 in Illinois. She was known for her sense of humor. She had been in a relationship for 7 years, and they were planning to get married after she graduated. She had wanted to become a psychiatric nurse. Pamela Lee Wilkening was born on August 2, 1945 in Chicago Heights. She loved children and fast cars. In high school, she had been in the Future Nurses Club, Pep Club, and on the swimming team. She enjoyed playing piano and taught a girl who she babysat how to play. She was the class rep for the Student Nurse Association of Illinois. It was a very exciting time for the women. They were finishing their last year of school and were about to embark on their nursing careers. A lot of them were engaged and planning marriages. They were all on the brink of this next exciting chapter in their life. On the morning of July 13, 1966, Richard went to the hiring hall, but no ship assignments were available. He called his sister Martha, and she and Jean drove to the hiring hall and gave him $25. Richard used it to get a room at the Shipyard Inn. He then took the rest of the money and went to bars. Life was not going well for Richard. He didn't have a place to live. He couldn't get work. His ex-wife, who he despised, had moved on quickly. He had a warrant in Texas. Monmouth cops were looking to question him for the murder of Catherine Pierce. All of this rage and frustration was building up in Richard until it finally exploded. While at a bar on the evening of July 13th, Richard saw 52-year-old Ella Mae Hopper and followed her. He confronted her on a sidewalk with a knife and forced her to go to his room at the Shipyard Inn. He raped her, stole her gun, then left. He drank some more at the Shipyard Inn's bar, then left on foot around 10:20 p.m. He walked a mile and a half to the townhomes near the hiring hall. He had his knife, and now he had a gun. He got to the townhome at 2319 East 100th Street around 11 p.m. Only 6 of the women were home at the time. Richard cut the screen on the back door and broke in. He went up to the second floor and knocked on a bedroom door. Cora got out of bed and opened the door, thinking it was one of the other women, but it was Richard Speck pointing a gun at her. He made she and her roommate Merlita go into the largest bedroom where Pamela, Patricia, and Valentina were. Nina Jo was in another room. Richard woke her up and forced her in the bedroom with the other women. He said he was not going to hurt them, he was just going to rob them, then flee to New Orleans. He forced them at gunpoint to get their purses and then sit on the floor in the big bedroom. He sat on the floor and casually smoked some cigarettes as he rummaged through their purses. Cora later said anytime they moved even just a little bit, Richard would point the gun at them. They were obviously scared, but they were thinking if they just did what he said, he would rob them and then go on his way. They were trained nurses. They knew how to remain calm in stressful situations. Around 11:40 p.m., the front door opened. This was Gloria arriving home from dinner with her fiancé and his mother. Richard waited at the top of the stairs, and when Gloria reached the top, he pointed the gun at her and forced her into the big bedroom. Murder actually wasn't Richard's plan that night. He wanted to rob them and rape at least one of them. He had already been full of so much rage when he got to the townhome, and then seeing Gloria further infuriated him, because Gloria looked a lot like his ex-wife who he hated. Richard later said, quote, "Things got out of control," unquote. Richard took bed sheets and used his knife to cut them into strips. He used those strips to tie the women's ankles together and their hands behind their backs. He hadn't tied up Cora and Merlita yet when the doorbell rang. This was another nurse who had left something behind when she had been studying at the house earlier. Richard led Cora and Merlita down the stairs, but they didn't open the door. When nobody answered, the nurse assumed everybody was asleep and she left. So Richard brought Cora and Merlita back upstairs and tied them up. A little after midnight, Richard untied Pamela and forced her into another bedroom. He attempted to rape her, but she fought and spit in his face. Around this time, Suzanne arrived home with Marianne, who was going to spend the night there. They had been out that night with another nurse named Pat Waddington. She lived at the townhome, but for some lucky reason, she decided to spend the night at the townhome next door with other nurses who were friends. Marianne and Suzanne walked up the stairs and saw Pamela being attacked by Richard. Their presence surprised him. They screamed and tried to run, but Richard grabbed them and forced them in the room with Pamela. This was when all of Richard's rage and frustration came to a head. He violently attacked the women. He stabbed Marianne 4 times, including once in her eye. He stabbed Suzanne 18 times and strangled her with her stocking. He stabbed Pamela directly in her heart. Richard went into the bathroom, washed the blood off his hands, then went back into the big bedroom where the other women were. With 3 women already dead, Richard thought he better just kill everybody else so there'd be no witnesses. He grabbed Nina Jo and took her into another room. The women could hear her scream and struggle, and then there was silence. Then they heard the sound of the water running in the bathroom as Richard washed more blood off his hands and knife. He grabbed Valentina next. He spent about 20 minutes murdering her and then washed the blood off, then grabbed Merlita. When Richard was attacking her, Cora heard her cry out, "Masochist." I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it meant, "It hurts." Richard sliced Merlita's throat so deep you could almost put your hand fully in the wound. While Richard was out of the room, Cora was able to make her way under one of the bunk beds. Gloria had drunk champagne that evening and was mildly intoxicated, so she fell asleep. Can you imagine how terrifying it must have been for the women in that room? One by one, your friends are drug out of the room, you hear screaming and struggling, and then silence. And then you hear the water running in the bathroom, and you know he's coming back to grab one of you, and it could be you. Cora said as she hid under the bed, she began to pray. Richard grabbed Pat next and took her into the bathroom. He told her to lie down, but she refused, so he kicked her hard in her stomach. He murdered her and left her laying on the bathroom floor. Richard either strangled or stabbed the women. When asked years later why he didn't shoot them because he had a gun, Richard said guns make too much noise and he wasn't in shape to run. When it was just Gloria and Cora left alive, Cora was still hiding under the bed. Richard had lost count of the women and he thought just Gloria was left. He picked up Gloria, put her on one of the beds, and raped her. Cora had to witness this from her hiding spot under the bed. She said she held her hand over her mouth to try to keep herself silent. Richard then forced Gloria to go downstairs, where he assaulted her again on the couch. He then strangled her to death. Richard went back upstairs, thinking he had murdered everyone in the house. He went through their purses one more time, then left the townhome. He crossed a bridge and threw the knife into the river. He then went back to the Shipyard Inn. Cora stayed under the bed for a few hours, too afraid to move. Around 5:30 a.m., she was able to untie her hands and feet. She walked out into the hallway and saw an utterly horrific scene. The bloody bodies of her friends were everywhere. She ran to a second-floor window, broke out of it, and stood on the ledge. She screamed for help. Somebody heard her and called 911. Cora gave a detailed description of the killer to police. She told them about the tattoo on his arm. Police created a sketch and circulated it.
A white man with a crew cut, wearing a black or dark shirt and a light jacket, might be discovered by some citizen, and the information relating to his activities reported to us.
For the next couple days, Richard Speck was a highly wanted man.
The only thing that I might say to this man is that he is psychologically sick.
As I said before, this is the crime of the century.
Word quickly spread of the mass murder, and it was on the radio and in the papers. The crime was so shocking. 8 young women brutally murdered in their home. When Richard heard there was a survivor, he was surprised because he thought he had committed the perfect crime. Even with it all over the news, at first Richard wasn't too worried. He still hung out in local bars drinking. Detectives went to the hiring hall since it was so close to the scene of the crime and asked a man who worked there if the sketch looked like anybody he knew. He thought it looked like Richard Speck, so that he gave the police his name. They put Richard's photo in a lineup for Cora, and she picked him out. Police sent a message to the Shipyard Inn asking Richard to call the hiring hall. When Richard called, the manager asked him to come in so they could talk about jobs. This was a trap, but Richard didn't fall for it. He told the manager he would come in, but instead he took a cab to the Raleigh Hotel and rented a room. He went out to a bar and brought a sex worker back to his room. The next morning, she reported to the front desk that a man in that room had a gun. 2 police officers showed up and took Richard's gun, but didn't arrest him. It hadn't been widely reported to all of the police in that area that the prime suspect in the mass murder was Richard Speck. So they thought they were just dealing with a man who had a gun in a hotel room. Richard decided to head to Skid Row and hide there. He rented a room at the Star Hotel. He spent July 15th drinking with a man who mentioned how he jumped on freight trains to get out of town. Richard asked this man if he could help him get out of Chicago on a train. This man was already a little suspicious of Richard, so he said no. He then called police and told them he thought the suspect of that mass murder was staying in the Star Hotel and gave them his room number. But police did not follow up on that lead. Police had collected fingerprints on one of the doors in the townhome, and they didn't belong to any of the women, so they wondered if they belonged to the killer. They asked for Richard's fingerprints from the hiring hall, and it was a match. Police held a press conference officially announcing Richard Speck as the prime suspect. Richard could feel the walls closing in on him. While he was in his room at the Star Hotel on the night of July 16th, he attempted to end his own life by breaking a bottle of wine and cutting his wrists with the broken glass. A hotel clerk called 911, and Richard was brought to the Cook County Hospital. One of the medical residents recognized Richard because he had seen the sketch of the suspect in the paper. He knew the killer had a tattoo that was the exact same tattoo that his patient had.
I was looking for this tattoo mark that had been written in the paper, "Born to Raise Hell." I saw some blood on his left arm, and I wiped the blood away. I saw this V, this large V up here.
The medical resident called police, and Richard was arrested. While he recuperated in the hospital, he was kept under armed guard. They brought Cora to the hospital so she could look at him through a window, and she confirmed he was the killer. Richard claimed he couldn't remember most of the night of the murders. He claimed the last thing he remembered was being in the Shipyard Inn bar around 8 p.m., drinking alcohol and injecting himself with speed. Meanwhile, funerals for the nurses were held. What a travesty for so many families. It also devastated the local nursing community. The Filipino women's bodies were sent back to their homeland. Richard was found competent to stand trial and deemed sane at the time he committed the murders. A psychiatrist diagnosed him with anxiety, depression, OCD, and a Madonna prostitute attitude towards women. It was noted he had had several head injuries when he was younger, which is a very common trait among psychopaths. Richard's trial began on April 3, 1967 in Peoria. Cora testified in front of him, which had to be so intimidating, but she was so brave and strong. When asked in court if she could identify the killer, she stood up, walked directly in front of Richard, pointed at him, and firmly said, "This is the man." Richard was found guilty and sentenced to death by electric chair. In 1972, the Supreme Court ruled the death penalty was unconstitutional, so Richard was resentenced to 1,200 years in prison, 150 years for each woman he killed. For some asinine reason, starting in 1976, Richard was eligible for parole. He was always denied parole, but why the heck was that even an option?
I don't think that they should ever release him, and I hope and pray that people will never forget this case and back us up after we're gone.
Richard settled into prison life. He asked a guard if he could paint his cell, and the guard got him a bucket of paint. Richard painted his cell so well, they had him paint other areas of the prison. That's why in some of the pictures of Richard from prison, his clothes are covered in paint. Richard was still a psychopath. One time a bird flew into his cell through the window. It was injured and Richard nursed it back to health. He tied a string to the bird's leg and kept it as a pet. But one day a guard came in and told him that pets weren't allowed. Richard walked over to a spinning fan and threw the bird directly into the blades. The guard looked at him horrified and said, "Why did you do that? I thought you liked the bird." Richard said, "I did, but if I can't have it, no one can." Richard got away with a lot in prison. He was in the Statesville Correctional Center, and holy moly, did they not keep a good eye on their prisoners. Richard did drugs, he had cigarettes smuggled in, he made moonshine and was often drunk. He wasn't afraid of getting in trouble. He said he was already in prison for 1,200 years. What else could they do to him? In 1978, Richard did an interview with the Chicago Tribune and for the first time confessed to killing the nurses. On December 5th, 1991, one day before his 50th birthday, Richard Speck died from what they think was a heart attack.
Richard Speck, one of Chicago's most notorious criminals, is dead.
His sister had him cremated and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location. Before being cremated, Richard's brain was removed and analyzed by a neurosurgeon. She found out that his hippocampus and amygdala were basically on top of each other. The hippocampus controls memory and the amygdala controls rage and emotions. So this could have been the reason Richard was such a violent deviant. They stored Richard's brain for further testing, but somebody stole it, and to this day, nobody knows where it is. This case doesn't end with Richard going to prison or his death, because things got really frickin' weird. 5 years after Richard died, a homemade videotape was sent to a Chicago news anchor named Bill Curtis. Yes, the Bill Curtis.
10 years after murdering 8 student nurses in a South Side townhouse, Richard Speck had his first parole hearing today.
He was sent this video because he worked in the news, and it was sent to him anonymously. The tape had been filmed back in 1988 by prisoners at the Statesville Correctional Center, and Richard is in the video. He's doing cocaine, marijuana, and he and another prisoner have a handful of cash.
Yeah, John, you know how much fun I've had. This church was loose.
At one point, Richard strips down to silk panties, and it's very obvious there had been some new developments.
You wearing blue panties today? Yeah. Can you see
Richard had hormones smuggled into the prison, so he would grow female breasts. He knew he was a high-profile inmate, and high-profile inmates are often attacked in prison. Richard thought if he looked more like a woman and let other inmates have sex with him, they wouldn't kill him because he basically served a purpose.
Do you like being by men?
Absolutely.
Have you always liked being by men?
Sure.
In the video, Richard talks very casually about the murders.
What you locked up for?
They count murder.
Did you kill him?
Sure I did.
Why?
Just one day night. I found the badger struck one of them, hit him in the face. If she's going to kick me out of the lineup, I went off here and checked the night. And there's 2 more there, so I off them. Wound up trying to kill off all the women. She was always flirting with me. She was laughing at me. I knew I had all the time in the world. I got your jaw cocky to get naked, baby. Then when she got naked, you had nothing I wanted, I killed her. That person was not like this on TV. Got 3 seconds in the bed. Well, you gotta go after about 3.5 minutes. It takes a lot of strength.
How'd you feel after killing those ladies?
Like I always felt. Had no feeling. And if I felt sorry, like, no.
Bill Curtis showed this video to Illinois legislator to show them that the prisons needed a lot better control.
So often we create a monster out of Richard Speck. Sometimes it is worthwhile to back off and say, well, maybe he wasn't a monster. Maybe he was all too human. That is the most frightening thing of all.
To end this on a happy note, Cora, the lone survivor, moved back to the Philippines and got married. But then she and her family moved back to the United States. She had a long career as a nurse and is now a grandmother. That's all I have for this case. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.